There was once an unprecedented time in American history when common citizens of their day began to define the rights of man and documented how those rights were being violated by their current government. They wrote to each other. They debated with each other. Ultimately, it was these common citizens who recorded these rights for all eternity, and furthermore created a new and free nation founded on these rights with liberty and justice for all of its citizens. Times have changed, but these rights remain.
I don't take responsibility.
That all citizens have the right to life. That all citizens have the right to pursue happiness. That all citizens are created equal. That all citizens have the right to a public trial. That all citizens have the right to peacefully assemble. That all citizens have the right to petition their government. What happens when you try to exercise these rights today? Is this government honoring your rights? Or are they violating them? Is this the government that those citizens aspired to? There is a solution.
I don't take responsibility. I don't take responsibility. I don't take responsibility.
Join me every Sunday afternoon for a new show where common citizens, you and I together, discuss with each other issues of today, where we demand proof and evidence is required, where we seek the truth and will not be silent. Join me this coming Sunday afternoon and take part in America's oldest and most honored tradition. Hello and welcome to The Left Speaks. My name is Chris. Happy Easter to everybody. Today is April the 4th, 2021. Almost exactly 3 months, a couple of days shy, removed from the insurrection attempt at the Capitol incited by former President Donald J. Trump, for which there still have been no consequences for said former president and those around him who helped spread the lies related to massive voter fraud. Those lies are currently, as we will show, causing Republicans around the country, specifically in state legislatures, to try and enact massive restrictions on what it would take to be an eligible voter. Based on this lie, the lie being that there was massive fraud in the 2020 federal election for president and senators and everything else, Republican governors, Republican state legislatures, Republican United States senators and House members are opposing American citizens' fundamental right to vote. Now, we've covered some of this in depth before on this show. This was before Trump started spreading lies and before the insurrection attempt on January the 6th to overturn a fair election, a valid election that President Trump lost. We're going to go into why House Resolution 1, HR1, the For the People Act, is necessary, We're going to go into why it took until 2021 for it to become necessary again. This is not the first time we've had to do something like this. We're going to show the evidence, as always, that led to my conclusions on this subject, because I can understand some conservative objections to voter ID laws and keeping people from voting that recently moved. The problem, as always, is the implementation. The way these things have been used in the past, even when they sound reasonable, and I'm not talking the distant past here, as we'll demonstrate, leads to trying to keep people from voting that are going to vote against Republicans. Leads to trying to rig the game so that it benefits me as a Republican. And most conservatives I know aren't interested in cheating to win. Fairness, in my personal experience, and I admit right now that this is anecdote, but fairness and following the rules seems to be a fundamental value that I share with conservatives. So how have we reached such different conclusions on this? Because on the face of the messaging from the Republican Party, it sounds like voter restrictions, tighter voter ID laws, keeping people from being able to register to vote easier. These things sound reasonable on their face until, like I said, you dive into how they've been used, more importantly, how they've been abused around the country consistently, and the fact that there is just no evidence, none whatsoever, of massive fraud in elections around the country influencing federal, or for that matter, state, or for that matter, local elections. All these restrictions that Republicans seem, and again, I'm not talking about the individual Republican conservative here, the average caller that calls in on this stream that's a reasonable person, the average friend that you have that votes Republican occasionally, or hell, even religiously. I'm talking about the legislators, the Republican lawmakers, and the Republican donors, as we will demonstrate in this call, who are using and abusing this basic belief in fairness to rig the system to their advantage. It is up to you and me, voting rights advocates, and every American who believes in democracy, to talk to those who disagree with us, help understand their concerns, and help explain why we aren't nearly as concerned with it as they are. If there is a real problem with voter fraud, anybody who pointed it out could absolutely get me on board with fixing that problem. The issue is, no one to date, even when they make wild claims about it, like Tucker Carlson, like Trump's former attorney Sidney Powell, who made all the wild claims about Dominion voting machines and them being rigged from Venezuela by Hugo Chavez and all that bullshit, as we'll show, none of them are rooted in fact. none of them are rooted in reality. And those aren't my words. Those are the words of her and her attorneys. Those are the words of the attorneys for Fox News when they have to go into court and defend the bullshit that they're spreading. Dash Mickey, thanks for joining. As always, I appreciate it. So I think I am misunderstanding. What are they trying to do with our voting rights? House Resolution 1, passed and supported primarily by Democrats, is trying to expand access to voting rights for all Americans and to make it more difficult for any legislature at the state level to restrict access to voting, be that by voter ID laws, be that by chopping up the lines for different districts so that way we can get, just enough Republicans or just enough Democrats in this one to always win it and split the vote of the opposition. Gerrymandering is what it's called. Trying to make that more difficult. Trying to make the big donors, the billionaires that donate millions and millions of dollars to these campaigns, have to put their names on the money that they're donating so you know where it's coming from. Whereas Republicans, and we're going to use Georgia as the most obvious example because, of course, it's Georgia, are trying to restrict access to voting. Georgia just passed a law restricting the number of ballot drop-off locations, ballot drop boxes around the state. And we'll go into Governor Kemp's defense of that, the governor of Georgia. I'm not going to one-side him, blindside him here. They just passed a law that said if you're standing in line, it is illegal for somebody to come give you food and water if you're standing in line to vote. The polling location can choose to do that, but any third-party organizations, be it a political group, be it a church group, be it me bringing my own mother food and water while she's standing in line, are now barred from doing that. That's a good thing, right? Aren't there already enough conservatives in many conservative states moving voting polls and whatnot to make it harder? Exactly. But if you're a conservative and you believe that voter fraud is this massive problem, then voting restrictions make perfect sense because it would make it more difficult to commit fraud. The problem is nobody can demonstrate this fraud actually exists. They're proposing solutions to a problem they can't show exists. It would be like me advocating that we need to build a dome over the entire country to stop the aliens from abducting people and making them vote Democrat. A dome might fix that problem, but if the problem doesn't exist, it's a waste of time, money, and taxpayer dollars and effort on behalf of government employees and officials, which is wasting more taxpayer dollars. And if I require everybody to prove that aliens didn't convince them to vote a particular way, and if they can't prove it, then I can throw their vote out. Well, that's ripe for abuse. And again, the dome might be a perfectly reasonable solution if the problem was real. Which from my point of view and my research is exactly what we're dealing with here. Some of these restrictions Republicans are suggesting, imposing, passing into law may seem reasonable on their face. Some of them don't. But nobody has shown that the problem exists that they're trying to fix in reality. And when we look at the history of these things, the history of these laws that have been passed to restrict American citizens' ability to vote, they've disproportionately hit minority voters and people who tend to vote Democrat. That's just the reality of it. The outcome is a problem. If you're just trying to make it so that the opposition can't vote so you can win, then you're just trying to rig the game. And yes, Dash Mickey, I agree. It is completely ridiculous. So let's go into an introduction to HR1, House Resolution 1, the For the People Act. And then we're also going to go into Georgia and the recent law they passed restricting access to voting, which HR1 would conflict with.
Now, you would think that most people would agree that we should try to make voting secure and accessible, that we should have confidence in the results, and that we should make it possible for as many people to cast a ballot as we can. However, while HR1 is debated at the federal level, Republicans increasingly are seeking to make it harder to vote in individual states. Not all these obstacles are crazy. There's a reasonable debate to be had over things like voter ID, which sound like common sense to a lot of people. But when Republicans in Texas require ID and then make it acceptable to use a gun license, but not a student ID, as they did several years ago, that sends a message that these efforts may not really be so much about preventing cheating, and may have more to do with gaining a political advantage. And then, when you really dig into the issues of voting and election security, you realize that voter ID is a solution for a problem that largely does not exist.
We've been looking for fraud, and I know what evidence is available, and there's not anything like enough evidence to make the bold assertion that our elections are rigged and fraudulent.
So as we saw there, the short version is we're going to pass voting ID laws. And this didn't just happen in Texas. On those voting ID laws, we're going to allow forms of ID that the majority of people who happen to vote for us just happen to have. Gun owners tend to vote Republican. I think that's a fair statement. Especially folks who would carry a concealed carry weapons permit. Not all, not universal, but it tends to lean that way. So that's okay. You can bring in your concealed carry permit, and that'll be an acceptable form of ID if you want to vote. However, youth in America, young people, and college-educated people tend to vote Democratic. They tend to vote for the Democrats. Again, not all, not universal, but it leans that way by a statistically significant margin. We're not going to allow those forms of ID. So if you tend to vote against me, an ID that you would commonly have, we're just not going to accept that one. If you tend to vote for me, an ID that you would probably have, that's okay. It seems a little bit like you're trying to make the playing field just a little uneven here. Seems a little bit like you're just trying to say the people that normally vote against you, we're going to make it a little bit more difficult for you to vote. And the people that vote for me, we're going to make it a little bit more easy for you to vote. And as we saw in the last election, when things start getting really, really close, those little bitty steps can start to add up. It's not like we needed to take a ton of votes away from Trump in Michigan in 2016 for him to lose that state. it's not like a ton of votes needed to change in Georgia for Democrats to lose that state. So these margins, when you start adding them up, start making a difference. Just a few less people make a huge difference if you can target it based off of how people tend to vote. That Weebo9, welcome to the stream. I appreciate you dropping in. This take will be from Bloomberg, far left, very extremely pro-business YouTube channel, Bloomberg.
Let's start with, let's talk voting rights here. What's in this bill, and why did the House feel like they needed to do it?
Yeah, Tim, I mean, this was interesting. I mean, we heard Kevin saying that there were a number of votes taken up by the House because of the threats for today, and this was one of them. And so the House House Democrats have really been working to secure and expand voting rights for all Americans for a number of years since the 2018 midterms. But now it's coming at a really critical time because as we're seeing across the nation, a lot of lawmakers, many Republican lawmakers, are trying to actually roll back some of the protections that people have to vote. And so this specific bill, it's called HR1, and it targets a number of those actions that House Democrats feel are threatened. So I want to go through a few of those. It mandates automatic voter registration. It expands early and mail-in voting. It restores the rights to formerly incarcerated people to vote. And it also targets things like ending partisan gerrymandering and creating more transparency when it comes to campaign finance. So it's a lot of things that House Democrats have been sort of focused on for the past few years, but it's coming at a pretty critical time here in this country.
Yeah, at a time when Republican state legislatures across the country are trying to limit voting because they realize that if they expand voting, and they've said this out loud, if they expand voting rights and make it easier for people to vote, it threatens the future of the party.
If we expand voting rights, it threatens the future of the party. Then maybe you should change what your party tries to run on so that you can get more fucking votes instead of trying to keep people from voting, instead of trying to keep American citizens from voting. So they touched on a few things there, and we're going to touch on a few of them just real quick. Automatic voter registration. Go to the DMV, sign up for your driver's license, boom, you're registered to vote. It applies to citizens. It's limited to citizens of the United States of America. Call me crazy. Why wouldn't we let these people vote? Why wouldn't we just automatically register them? They can still choose not to go vote. Me personally, I'd be in favor of making everybody show up to the polls on election day and making election day a federal holiday. If you want to show up to the polls and choose not to vote or choose to vote for Elvis, hey, such is your business. But I think asking you once, twice a year to show up and do a democracy is not that high of a price to ask you for living in this country and benefiting from this country and all the things we have in place. Let me bring chat back real quick. So automatic voter registration is one of the big ones. Increased mail-in voting. Why not? When we look at all the history, I think mail-in voting fraud rate is at 0.00009%. Less than 1%. Less than 0.1%. Less than 0.100%. So why would I not make it easier for Americans to vote however the hell they want to? Me personally, I travel for work. I am gone Monday through Friday. damn near every week. Why should I have to jump through an extra hoop to fill out a ballot?
The time
Thanks
for
for the
silence
follow.
is over.
I appreciate it, that weeb. But why would I want to make it more difficult for American citizens to vote? Gerrymandering. We're going to restrict that. That's where state legislatures redraw the lines of the districts. So that if I have one city that's primarily Democratic, I can have 5 districts come and take a little piece out of that city and divide up all those Democratic votes so that my team can win. That's not representation. That's gaming the system so that you can get increased representation. So we're going to make that illegal. We're going to restrict the ability, not just of Republicans, but of any political party, to try and rig the districts so that they can just slightly win. And I forget which state it is, but there's a state, I want to say North Carolina, but don't hold me to it, where the population voted 60% for Democrats and Republicans got the majority of the seats in that state Senate. And I'm sure you can find a state that goes the other way. But again, why would I want to not address this problem? It's a demonstrable problem. It exists in reality. Why would I want to not address it? One of the other big ones, campaign finance reform. These nonprofit groups that come out and run all these attack ads and all these issues-based campaigns and these political action committees that aren't supposed to talk to the candidates, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we know they are. If you donate money to them, we're going to require you to list everybody that's on the board and everybody that's donating to it so we can figure out who's donating all this money, what issues they're backing, what nonprofits they're backing. Festo and Choi, welcome to the stream. Today's stream is about HR1, the For the People Act that recently passed the House and has moved to the Senate. We're also going to be talking about the history of voter suppression in the United States of America, and specifically what is pushing or what is causing the push for a Voting Rights Act at the federal level. We're going to look specifically at the state of Georgia and the recent law they passed restricting voting rights. If you disagree with anything, you are always more than welcome to call in. The number is toll free and it's down there at the bottom of the screen. It's always open whenever I'm live. Same goes to you, that weeb. You're more than welcome to call in. Agree, disagree at any point in time. Dash Mickey, obviously the same goes for you, but you're well aware you're here all the time. I appreciate it. So to go back to the fixing campaign finance, at least we would know where the money was coming from. And this is an issue that polls well, whether you're Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, communist, fascist, it doesn't matter. Everybody wants to know where this money is coming from that's influencing elections. Liberals, progressive, the far left, regular Democrats, they want to know where all the money from the Koch brothers is going to and what issues they're pushing. So we can say, hey, these 15 organizations that all say that they're against this particular bill, yeah, it's all coming from the same guy. It's just a bunch of different names. Republicans, they feel the same way about George Soros. Oh, Soros? Yeah, he's actually the one bankrolling these 10 organizations. Well, it wouldn't be guesses anymore, guys. It would be disclosed and it would be fact. And you wouldn't need a team of investigative journalists to chase it down. You would just know because they would have to disclose it. So again, that one polls well on both sides. And the Koch brothers are particularly worried about this, as came out in a leaked audio call, which again, we'll jump to in a minute. Gerrymandering from Dash Mickey. Gerrymandering is a practice intended to establish an unfair political advantage for a particular party or group by manipulating the boundaries of electoral districts, which is most commonly used in first-past-the-post electoral systems. That's correct. The easiest way to think of gerrymandering for that weeb is we can take the state of California, for instance, right? And if you divided up the state of California in particular ways, right? Like let's say that all of rural California tends to vote Republican, but there's a ton of Democrats that live in the city of Los Angeles, right? Just a ton. But that's where all the Democrats are. We're going to say 100% of all the Democratic voters in California live in Los Angeles, right? And the whole rest of the state is Republican. That's obviously not the case, but it makes it easier to picture for most people. Okay. Well, let's say that there's 10 districts in the state of California. Okay. Now, a fair way to do that, if you had half of the people that lived in California voted for Democrats and half of the people that lived in California voted for Republicans, ideally those 10 seats should be 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans. That would be fair. That would mirror what the people want. And we're supposed to represent the people, right? But if I want to get tricky here, okay, let's say I divide LA, where all the Democrats live, into 2 districts, and I divide the rest of the state into 8 districts, where all the Republicans live. So now I'm going to end up with 2 Democrats versus 8 Republicans. So Republicans have 80% of the representation at the state level, even though they only have 50% of the voters. Now, like I said, both sides are guilty of this to an extent. Republicans have been a lot more guilty of it recently. They had a project called Project Red Map. And that started, I want to say, after Obama's first victory. But if you Google it, I'm sure you can pull it up. Project Red Map, where basically they wanted state legislatures, when they got elected, to redraw the lines for their districts at the local level to make it more likely that a Republican would win particular districts. Yeah, gerrymandering is extremely unfair, and it doesn't matter which side does it, right? It also, and I can't demonstrate this empirically, but just on a gut level and from thinking about it, right? If you tend to draw your districts so that only one side is ever going to win, like let's say we had a Democrat district, right? And we knew that only Democrats were going to be able to win that district because we drew it so that there just weren't enough Republicans to ever win, right? And then the same thing for the Republican district. Only Republicans were ever going to win that district. Well, then your general election between the two parties isn't competitive. Whoever wins that primary is going to win that district. We already know this, right? So that causes more and more radical people to start winning. Because if I'm going to run in the Republican district, well, I've got to be more Republican than whoever else I'm running against. I've got to be more conservative than whoever else I'm running against, because that's who's going to win that seat. It's going to be a Republican anyway, right? So I've got to be more Republican. And the same is true on the left side, right? If I'm running in a Democratic district and only a Democrat's going to win, then I've got to be more left. I've got to be more progressive. I've got to be more Democrat than anybody else I'm running against, right? So you start seeing this, that they'll go more and more extreme and further away from the center. Like I said, I can't back that point empirically at this point in time, but that's what I've come to see when I look at these seats. It's bad for the country. It's bad for the individuals in that district. It's bad at the state level. It's basically drawing the map so that it favors you, whether it should or it shouldn't. It's not about representing the population at that point. It's about trying to draw the map so that your team wins. But shouldn't it not be allowed because it's unfair? I agree. HR1, House Resolution 1, the For the People Act, agrees. The extreme versions of it are already illegal. This would start the problem you run into is the definition of extreme. And then the other problem you run into is the people that are currently elected, it makes it easier for them to get reelected. So they are incentivized to a certain extent to help keep the system the way it is because it's benefiting them. Think of it as like, I don't know, we can look at a game of football, right? Because those 10-yard lines and the length of the touchdown and all that stuff is just arbitrary. It's something we came up with, right? And we all agreed to make it fair, right? But if home field advantage, let's say my team was like really good at defense but terrible at offense, right? Well, if I made my touchdown zone a hell of a lot bigger, it would certainly benefit me. It wouldn't be fair, but it would benefit me. So unless somebody came in and said I couldn't do that, I would be incentivized to do that. And that's the problem. I mean, these are obviously high stakes races, right? And both parties are incentivized to try and tweak the rules just enough. So it comes down to us, the American people, to force them via voting, via activism, to push for fair instead of just what benefits my party. It makes you sad it's not right. Well, the good thing is, like I said, people are trying to address it. And I agree with you. But when you get sad, remember that you have a voice, whether it's through social media, whether it's through voting, whether it's through activism and protest. You have a constitutional right to assemble, right? So you can protest. These are things that there are things that you can do to help advocate against these things. And democracy is better when more people are involved. But I agree with you. It's a big problem and we got to work on fixing it.
What about the Senate, though? I mean, passes in the House. Any chance of this passing in the Senate?
I mean, so the thing is, Tim, this was really largely voted along party lines. We saw it 220 to 210. And so a lot of the reports that we're getting is that it is unlikely to pass in the Senate. But I think we have to think, too, about sort of what is happening here in this country, right? As you can see here, there are a number of restrictive voting bills that are happening across the country. As you mentioned, a lot of those are coming from Republicans. And I think we should note a lot of those target minority voters, right? And so Democrats feel like this is important to increase voter turnout. It will help people get out to the polls the next time. Republicans, though, say that, it's not up to the federal government. It is up to states to decide on this. But, this wasn't always partisan, Tim. As we know, it's really increased over the past few years. And so it's going to be really difficult for Democrats to pass this in the Senate because they will need 10 Republicans to get on their side.
Yeah, and look, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of Republicans who are talking about this on the national level are talking about irregularities in the 2020 election. Remember, have been no confirmed widespread reports, or no confirmed reports of widespread irregularities. And in fact, the former president's own Department of Homeland Security called this a safe and fair election. What about when it comes to police reform? Because the House was.
Babylon done left. Welcome to the stream. I appreciate it. If this country had completely fair elections, the Republican Party wouldn't stand a chance at getting reelected. I agree with you. And the Republican Party has agreed with you. That's why they're against more Americans voting. That's why they're against increased voting rights access. We're going to go into specifically the state laws in Georgia that were just passed restricting American citizens' rights to vote in terms of when and how they can vote. I appreciate you dropping in. That Weeb, let me know when you're back, brother. I will address your I thought protesting was bad bit, because I disagree. Protesting can be a wonderful thing, and it's one of your constitutional rights. Dash Mickey, I tend to agree with you. We have a right to peacefully protest. Violent protest, however, that's bad. The key take from that last clip, besides the screen that shows you everything we just covered that HR1 does, such as automatic voter registration, disclosing where federal or where money comes from when it comes to electioneering, making it more difficult to gerrymander, making mail-in voting automatic in terms of just being able to sign up and you're done. You don't need an excuse to mail in vote. The main takeaway from that was the objections Republicans are raising are centered around election fraud that they can't prove exists. That's the big one.
But for 2 decades, Republicans have used claims of fraud and cheating to justify erecting obstacles to voting, starting with the Bush administration in the early 2000s, and then really accelerating after the Supreme Court removed a key component of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 in their Shelby versus Holder decision.
At issue was a provision in the act that singled out states with a history of discrimination in voting, mostly in the South, and required them to get pre-clearance, approval from the federal government before changing voting procedures.
Then, of course, came Trump and the fiction that the 2020 election was stolen.
We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
We won this election, and we won it by a landslide.
Which ultimately led to the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol.
Fight for Trump!
They stole the election! They stopped the count and stole the election!
So now many in the GOP, rather than telling voters the truth about the election, are using the confusion and concern generated by Trump's lies to try to shape elections in a way that they think will help them win in the future. And here's the thing. There's a lot of evidence that getting more people to vote doesn't actually favor one party over the other.
Even the 2020 election, which Republicans feel like they didn't win, that's an election where it turned out there were 10 million more Republican voters than Republicans thought there were. Letting more people vote brings out more Republicans and Democrats.
That last take that they had, that when more people vote, it doesn't necessarily benefit one party, my research has not led to that same conclusion. However, as Americans, we are supposed to be in favor of democracy. I certainly am. And I want every eligible American citizen to be able to vote, and I don't want to make it difficult for them. And I certainly am not going to make it difficult for them based on a fiction, based on a myth of election fraud that has continually been pushed by the Republican Party since George Bush, without any substantial evidence. Every time I look into these, claims of voter fraud, I can find nothing backing them. Voting fraud rate overall in the United States is less than 0.0009%, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. That means you have a better chance if you and your friend are walking to the polls to vote or are standing in line to vote. There is a better chance that that person standing next to you gets struck by lightning than there is that they cast a fake ballot or a fraudulent vote. I don't see a big call or a big push by Republicans around the country to build lightning rods all over the place so that nobody gets struck by lightning on their way to the polls. And that's more likely than finding a verified case of election fraud. If you can't prove it's a problem, then I'm really not interested in your solution to the problem. I'm certainly not interested in your solution to the problem if it violates people's basic rights in a democracy. From Babylon Done Left, I know this is a little off topic, but what are your thoughts on abolishing the Electoral College and chasing a more direct version of American democracy? I would be in favor of it. I'm not in favor of the Electoral College overall. I think it's an outdated system that was put into place to appease slave states back during the formation of the Republic. Also, the founders of this country were very nervous about the average citizen voting, right? Because when we initially started, it was you had to basically be a white male property owner. And then senators were elected directly by the state legislatures, right? You had the Electoral College in place to keep a check on the masses. You had the senators being elected by the state legislatures to keep a check on the masses. You had the Electoral College in place to keep a check on the masses, the mass population of the American people. We've removed a lot of that stuff. I personally think it would be time to remove the Electoral College. Democrats in the Senate, I believe it is, represent 4.5 million more Americans than Republicans do. But yet both sides have 50 senators. And I think that's just undemocratic at its basic core. And I would be in favor of getting rid of it. Do I think states can use representation still? Yes, absolutely. But I don't think that a vote should count for more in, I believe it's Wyoming, than it does in California. I think your vote should be worth one vote, regardless of where you live. So yes, I would be in favor of abolishing the Electoral College. I hope that addresses your point, or your question rather. Now, why the push for HR1 now? 2020 had historic voter turnout. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the pretense Republicans are using, the excuse, is responding to the allegations of voter fraud and election irregularities. As of March 24th, legislators have introduced 361 bills with restrictive provisions in all 47 states. It's increased 43% in basically a month since February of 2021. Why would I not advocate? Why would I not support passing one bill at the federal level that can kill a lot of these 361 bills across 50 different states, instead of trying to kill all these 361 bills in 47, I believe it was, different states? We've already agreed that the problem of election fraud is minuscule, is so small that it's literally less likely than being struck by lightning. So instead of playing 361 games and counting of whack-a-mole every time somebody tries to bring up a new way to make it more restrictive for citizens in their state to vote, why not do it at the federal level? We all agree voting is democratic. We all agree American citizens have a right to vote. Why would I want to run around 47 different states when I can knock it out with one big hammer and say, hey, everybody gets to vote and here are the baseline rules? That's not saying states won't have some input, but it is saying you're not going to get to restrict American citizens' rights to vote. Period. Which to me is the fundamental right in a democratic system. This is not the first time we have seen this. James Redacted, welcome to the show. I'm progressive. I think in most European countries, depending on where you're from, I would be a soc dem, a social democrat. Basically, I'm going to go wherever the evidence leads to. I'm for reality-based politics. Evidence, reasoned argument, and you can move me on pretty much any position. But without evidence and without reasoned argument, such as the fantasies of voter fraud, you're not going to move me. But welcome to the show. I greatly appreciate it. In case you're new here, phone number is always toll free. The line is always open, and anybody who disagrees is more than welcome to call in or agrees or has questions. You're from the UK? Welcome, man. I greatly appreciate it. I welcome anybody to the show as long as they're civil and can present their argumentation and have evidence to back their points. Hell, even if they don't have evidence, if they're civil, I'll have a discussion with them. So this is not the first time we have seen this from Republicans. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, this is not recent. Or excuse me, this is a recent problem. Specifically to the state of North Carolina, okay? For decades in the state, black voter turnout lagged far behind white turnout. Then in 2000, state lawmakers opened up an early voting period. In 2005, they said voters could cast ballots outside of their assigned precinct, outside of their assigned location to vote. And in 2007, they enabled same-day registration. Okay? After those changes in the state of North Carolina, black voter registration and turnout surged. Okay? So those had the intended effect of evening the playing field in the state. The legislature at that point, the Republican legislature, said, oh shit, we can't have that. Black voters, minority voters in this state of North Carolina don't tend to vote for us. So their response was, the North Carolina legislature requested data on the use by race of a number of voting practices. And then with that data that was separated by race, enacted legislation that restricted voting and registration in 5 different ways. All 5 of which just happened to affect black voters more than they affected white voters. This is not a long time ago. The appeals court suggested that the motivation was fundamentally political. A Republican legislature attempting to secure its power by blocking votes from a population likely to vote for Democrats. in Texas, passed in 2011. The Texas state legislature had a problem with the type of photo IDs designated as legitimate. Military IDs and concealed carry handgun permits, they're okay. You can use those. But state employee photo IDs and university photo IDs are not. If you want to know why Democrats almost universally seem to be against voter ID laws, and you're just your average typical conservative Republican who thinks everybody should have have to have some kind of form of verification of who they are in order to vote, this is why. It's because when it's enacted at the state level by Republican legislators, they always try to game the damn system. They always try to rig the playing field. Why is a military ID okay, but a state employee ID not okay? Why is a concealed carry permit okay, but a student ID not okay to verify who you are? It almost seems like, just maybe to me, that we're trying to make it easier for the people who vote for us to be able to vote, and we're trying to make it harder for the people that don't vote for us to be able to vote. It almost seems like you're trying to rig the game. You're not trying to be fair. You're just trying to rig the game to benefit you. And the excuse you're using, you can't even prove exists. I'm willing to compromise on a lot of things. But democracy is non-negotiable, period. If you're an American citizen, I don't care whether you vote left, right, center. I don't care whether you're white, black, brown, yellow, purple, green, orange. I don't care whether you live in Texas or live in North Carolina. I don't care whether you live in Louisiana, Nevada, Alaska, or Washington, D.C. We fought a whole war over taxation without representation. You have a right to vote, and anybody that tries to make that right more difficult for you to access is somebody you should oppose. Smite Knight, welcome in. How long am I on today? Same as always, brother. I got about another hour left to go, but we may go into a little bit of overtime. 2 to 4 Pacific. That's my standard running time, but I appreciate you coming back. Good topics. Thank you. I appreciate that. Dash Mickey, thank you for answering. We'll probably be on for about another hour or so. That Weeb, welcome back. I'm going to jump into your question on protesting in just a minute. Babylon Done Left, I find it confusing how Republicans are generally against common sense gun regulations, yet they support voter ID laws. Yes, I tend to agree with you on that. I do understand. Last week's episode, I did a big thing on gun regulation, gun control versus Second Amendment rights in this country. The United States has a much stronger gun culture than most countries. I personally own an AR-15 in my house, and that's just a given. Okay. And I'm very progressive on a lot of things, but guns I tend to be more conservative on than most progressives you will run into. That being said, if you go back and watch last episode, there was a conservative streamer who called in Beyond the Tags. We reached very reasonable compromises, I think, between the both of us. I think there's a lot of room for compromise on both sides. I think ban all guns in this country is completely unrealistic, and I would not be in favor of it. I also think anybody can buy whatever they want, own whatever they want, whenever they want is also equally unrealistic and doesn't help at all. I do agree with you, and I think you're pointing to a key problem in terms of how Republicans are addressing these two issues. I can I can point to a lot more instances of gun violence and handgun deaths and firearm deaths in the United States of America than I can point to cases of voter fraud. But yet we want to highly restrict access to access to voting rights and slow everything down and make it more difficult to access that, but full steam ahead on access to firearms, no regulations whatsoever. And I do agree with you that those two positions, that thought process, it doesn't work both ways on both issues for Republicans in this country right now. And it's a serious question that they need to ask themselves, why not? James Redacted, I am currently in the state of Nevada. I live in Las Vegas. I travel all around the country Monday through Friday for my civilian real world job, which, hey, it pays the bills, right? I've also lived all over this country. I was born and raised in Louisiana. I've lived in Alaska. I've lived in West Texas. I've lived in Nevada. I've lived in Louisiana in between that. So Las Vegas is currently home, but I'm a little bit of everywhere. That Weeb, do you think that it's right for just anyone to own a gun? The short version is, I think you have a constitutional right to own a firearm. I do think there should be a way to remove that right from individuals that are at risk. The conversation last week, which you can go to the YouTube show and find, or you can go to the website, www.theleftspeaks.com. We'll give you a much broader, more in-depth explanation of that. I would be in favor of some form of gun licensing. I would be in favor of mandatory training when you try to switch gun classes. I would be in favor of more extended background period checks. If you had a particular gun class already, like you had a license for semi-automatic rifles and you wanted to buy a second one, then I wouldn't have a concern with it. If you just walked in off the street and wanted to buy 5 ARs for the first time or 16 handguns or whatever the case is, then I would have more issue. I also think, like I said, when you switch classes, so if you've had a shotgun for home defense for 20 years and all of a sudden you want to go buy 2 or 3 AR-15s and 5 handguns, that you need to take mandatory classes to learn how those weapons work, how they're different from the weapon you're currently certified in, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need a list of every gun you own, but I do want an extended background period check on it, and I want you to have to go through firearms training for that. Again, much more in-depth, much more nuanced take from last week's episode. James Redacted, over here in the UK, guns just aren't a thing besides in Northern Ireland, where they can all have guns, but that is due to the huge political tensions over there, and they are currently having massive riots and throwing petrol bombs at police, so not the most ideal pro-gun example at The Left Speaks. I would tend to agree with you. I would assume that a lot of the riots and violence is coming from the Brexit issue going on over there right now, which was unfortunately kind of predictable. At Smite Night, personally, I don't believe anyone should have a right to own a gun. I don't think anyone is a true constitutionalist, and therefore it made sense at the time as written, but not in modern society. I can see that argument, but to change that, you're going to need a constitutional amendment. So even if I agreed with you, which I don't, but like I said, I know I'm more conservative on guns than a lot of people are, especially on the progressive left. I don't foresee any kind of constitutional amendment getting passed to remove the American right to bear arms. I just don't see it. I don't think you're realistically ever going to get there. And I think talk like that is stopping you from making any progress. I don't think firearms are the issue. I think firearms in the hands of individuals that shouldn't have them is the issue. So if you can give me more background checks, some kind of gun licensing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to try and keep guns out of the hands that shouldn't have them, out of the individuals, then I'm perfectly fine to compromise on a lot of the other things. Brexit and accusations of police biased in favor of Irish Catholics. So Protestant Unionists have been rioting for 5 nights straight. Have the borders been reenacted over there? I haven't been keeping up on the Brexit mess, to be honest with you. I knew there was a big concern when Brexit was first voted on that putting a hard border between Ireland and North Ireland would be a major concern again. So Argus, welcome to the show. I greatly appreciate it. I'm just going to go with Argus because I don't want to slaughter the rest of your name. When's the last time someone used a firearm to protect themselves against the government? That is going to be entirely dependent on who you are asking. There are tons of people. If you want to go to the progressive left, you can point to the Black Panther Party, right? Which is hilariously the last time Republicans were in favor of gun control and gun control restrictions, right? Black Panthers started because they were worried about police brutality, and they would show up whenever another citizen in their neighborhood was pulled over, and they would be armed to monitor the interaction between the officer and the civilian, right? And that's when Reagan signed gun control legislation in the state of California. Those on the far right will point to Waco and several other instances where it was used to resist. Your question probably means successfully resist. That I can't answer for you because in my opinion, there have been a ton of failures of the Second Amendment, whether you go back all the way to the founding of the country and the Whiskey Rebellion, whether you want to look at the Civil War, right? The South failed, even though the Second Amendment existed, right? Whether you want to look at Waco and consider that, but that's a big question. At James Redacted, the border situation is a complete nightmare and it's leading to a lot of tensions. Unfortunately, that was predictable. It was one of the major problems we knew was going to happen with Brexit, and they kept trying to find a way around it. For those who are unaware, when the United Kingdom was part of the European Union, border restrictions were basically not a thing. You could cross border lines and it wasn't an issue. When you put a border back between Ireland and North Ireland, they were worried that there was going to be an exacerbation of tensions between, or specifically at that border, because you're creating checkpoints, which create a focal point for the violence again. Argus, thanks. Of course, man. You're more than welcome to ask any question here. And if you ever disagree or agree or whatever the case is, phone number's down there. It's toll free. You can call in whenever you want, assuming you're in the United States. I can't speak to foreign toll free. So if you're over in the United Kingdom like James is, you might want to be careful before you start dialing, because I don't want you to end up with a $1,000 bill. At Smite Night, I should clarify, I do agree that it's impossible to do a full ban on existing guns. I'm for gun buyback programs to encourage but not force a reduction in the number of guns, and have a grandfather clause where guns already in private hands don't need to be necessarily registered, but any purchase following the date of enforcement of a gun registration program. I would be fine with gun buyback programs, voluntary. I don't think it's going to solve the problem, but I would be okay with it. You could actually get me on board with that. I would be fine with the rest of it, the gun registration program. That's going to be a huge non-starter for a lot of Second Amendment proponents and a lot of conservatives straight off the bat. You might as well be trying to get an amendment passed to remove the Second Amendment, which again, I do not think you're anywhere close to having support for. In this country, like I said, we have a unique gun country for those of you who are from foreign countries that are watching the stream. And again, I greatly appreciate you being here. One of the big concerns Second Amendment proponents will raise is they don't want the government to have a list of every firearm they own. Period, full stop. A lot of these people who have gone out and done mass shootings will go out and buy a new class of firearm. They will go out and get an AR. They will go out and get their first AR. They will go out and get their first handguns, right? If a guy's already got 3 ARs, I don't need to know that he's got a fourth one or a fifth one or a sixth one. I really don't. I don't care, right? It's not the gun that's the problem. It's going to be the individual that has the firearm anyway. Okay. What I want to do is get eyes on the guy that just had some triggering event in his life that's going to go out and commit some kind of mass violence. I think that's a reasonable compromise to start at. And then if that works, then we can start looking at other things, okay, in terms of evidence-based policy. But I do not think that you are ever going to be able to overturn the Second Amendment in this country, nor would I personally want to. But like I said, I'm aware that I hold a different position on that than most progressives and liberals. James redacted. England, Scotland, Wales used to have the right to buy guns, similar to the Second Amendment. However, a massive school shooting happened in '96, first one in 100 years, and the government became incredibly unpopular, and they were voted out in a landslide election, partly because they didn't ban guns. The next government did a blanket ban of all guns and was met with huge celebration. In your country. I know Australia went through something extremely similar. They had, I believe it was the Port Arthur massacre, and then they did a buyback, and then gun violence reduced. This is why I said the United States has a singular, from what I've seen around the world, gun culture. I mean, there is a very vocal, fairly large minority of Americans that are extremely pro-Second Amendment. Since it's already part of our Constitution, you would have to get a amendment to the Constitution passed in order to really ban guns, which again, I personally am not in favor of, for clarification. But you're going to have to get 2/3 of all the states to ratify that amendment. And the reality of that happening in this country is about 0. And to illustrate that, y'all had one that you're pointing to. The government got kicked out on its butt when it didn't do anything about it, right? And then the next government did something about it immediately. If I ask you about the school shooting in the United States, you would have to stop and think about which one I'm even referring to. And we have still done nothing. And I'm not willing to let perfection, anybody's perfection, whether it's the 2A advocates that say just let everything go, or whether it's the I want to ban all guns crowd, I'm not willing to let perfection be the enemy of improvement. And I think we can do a lot to make this situation better and happen less often. But I don't think that ban all guns is anywhere near realistic. And I personally wouldn't support it. Mod, can you nuke Steel Car, please? I don't want to become famous by followers, primes, and viewers at whatever the hell he's selling. So just get rid of him. Thank you. Greatly appreciated. And you can ban Steel Car. That's obviously a bot account. James redacted. Oh, yeah, definitely. I don't think it would work in the United States. Federalism especially wouldn't allow it. That's a big part of it. And the other big part of it is it's, like I said, enshrined in our Constitution in the Second Amendment. So you're not going to get it out of there even if you wanted to, which again, for the conservative viewers, I am not personally in favor of. Smite Night, yes, a large amount of mass shooting in particular involves a small amount of time between purchase and act. So a longer wait time with universal background checks, etc., is the end of private sale loopholes. Yes, I would agree with that. You could get me on board with private sale loopholes being closed. I would be fine with having to take my private firearm to an FFL dealer. For those of you who are not gun nuts, that's, a federal firearms licensed dealer, and have to sign it over to the next guy. Okay. That would not bother me in the least. Beyond the Tags and I actually went even further than you did, Smite Knight. Like I said, if you wanted to switch weapon classes, so like, let's say you wanted to buy your first AR from me, right? And you already had a shotgun. Not only would you have a new background check and an extended waiting period when you switched over to that new weapons class, semi-automatic rifles, for instance, you would also have to take training at some sort of licensed firearms trainer, right, to become proficient in that firearm before you would be allowed to have it. So the way it works in our ideal world is, okay, let's say I'm going to sell Bob Smith my AR, and Bob Smith doesn't have an AR. We're going to go down to the gun shop, right? that has a range, okay? And I'm going to sign off that this is, Bob Smith's going to get this gun. Bob Smith's going to pay me, right? And then the gun store is basically going to lock up Bob Smith's firearm for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever extended waiting period we decide on, while Bob Smith's background check passes. During that time, Bob Smith, since he's never had a semi-automatic rifle, can go to that gun store and check out his weapon at the range that's attached to that gun store and take his classes, his number of hours, to become proficient in that firearm. And that instructor will have had basic training. I'm not imagining him being a licensed clinical psychologist or anything, right? But will have had basic training from the psychologist and from the social workers, from the mental health experts, about some potential red flags he might want to look out for. Like this guy is ranting and raving about his boss firing him a week ago, right? And this could be updated into the background check so that maybe this guy doesn't get his gun, okay? So it gets another set of eyes on this individual and teaches the individual how to use the firearm they just purchased. Now, like I said, once you have a license in that class, if you've already got an AR, I really don't care if you go buy another one. Doesn't bother me in the slightest, okay? But the guy that goes out and first buys them, or first buys handguns, or first buys a shotgun, just like when you first get a car, I've got no problem with teaching them the basics of how it works, making sure they know the basic safety, features, functions, and behaviors that they're supposed to do. I can't tell you how many times I've been out to a firing range and the idiots around me don't know the basics of firearm safety, and it drives me up a wall because I end up yelling at people, right? And some ranges have better safety officers than others. Okay, so I've got no problem with these kinds of things, and none of it requires that I know every firearm an individual owns. That Weeb, you're such a good streamer. Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. Every Sunday, 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific. You are more than welcome to like, follow, subscribe, whatever you need to do to find me. You can also find me on Twitter, and I'll make an announcement before I go live at any point in time. Smite Night. I would say you'd be surprised how few the Ban All Guns crowd is, even on Twitch. I agree with you. I think you would also be surprised how far or how small the minority of Second Amendment proponents is. That's, just let me own whatever I want to own. And the answer is always more guns. I think if you talk to them reasonably and you make it very clear up front that you're not a member of the Ban All Guns crowd, then you can reach these people and you can reach reasonable compromises. And we have to have the people that know firearms even better than I do personally if we ever want to get effective regulations passed. 10-round magazine limits are pointless. They do nothing. I can teach anybody who doesn't know how to use a firearm how to reload a magazine in 5 seconds. So a 10-round magazine isn't stopping much. Okay. So I think we need those people to come to the table. Smite Knight, your ideal system sounds similar to the German one minus the per gun license in favor of a class-based system. I will take your word on that. I do not know. That is just something that Beyond the Tags and I came to consensus on in about a 30-minute call. Beyond the Tags is a conservative streamer. And he called in. It was unscheduled. But it was a very nice conversation. Argus, I don't understand why some people are so convinced or determined that their right to own a firearm takes precedence over the safety and lives of society as a whole. It appears to me to be a lack of character, awareness of their society, and the real role that they should play. Individuals being selfish and greedy over the whole. I see how you can make that argument. The short version is there is a very big disconnect between how different individuals in this country view firearms. I live in Las Vegas currently. Okay. If I had grown up in an urban area with a gang problem or a gun violence problem, if you mentioned to me firearms, the first image that came to my mind would probably be of gun violence, drive-by shootings. drug shootouts on corners, that sort of stuff. When I lived in West Texas, if you mention guns to anybody, that's not remotely what comes to mind. What comes to mind is I might live 45 minutes from a police officer. And if I call 911, ain't nobody making it to my house in time. That's just a reality. I may also live somewhere rural where animals, wild animals, are truly a threat. I don't have to worry about a bear trying to knock down my front door if I live in Las Vegas. That was a concern when I lived in Alaska. Not for me personally, but for some of my soldiers. And all of that, between the different perceptions and everything else, does nothing to go back to address why the Second Amendment was created, what it was intended for, whether it was an individual right or whether it was a collective right, which has been argued back and forth in the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the Supreme Court came down on the side of it was an individual right, but I can see the argument for the opposition that it's a collective right. But none of that addresses the fact that, like I said, ban all guns from where I'm sitting is just not happening in this country. And if that's your position, that's fine. I see how you can make the argument for it. I disagree. But I think you're also, from a political standpoint, closing so many doors and so many ears and so many people that won't listen to you, that you're letting perfection be the enemy of improvement. You and I both want guns out of the hands of people that are going to use them to commit violence. That's a thing across the board pretty much everybody agrees on. So instead of going for ban all guns, which gets you nowhere in this country, and I think that's demonstrable. Like I said, I'm not disagreeing with your take here. I can see your argument. I just don't think you're ever going to get there, and you're hurting your own cause when we can find common cause across the country and make some massive improvements. That would be where I would be. From James Redacted, in all fairness, I talk about how few guns are in Great Britain, but I remember being 7 years old holding a rifle with a family member in our back garden, so I'm not sure how the laws work as of today, but I'm from northeast of England, which is basically UK's no man's land. Fair enough. And that's the big difference, right? If you grew up in an urban area or you were close to any kind of gun violence, when somebody mentions firearms, you're thinking of that violence. If you grew up out in the middle of, West Texas and somebody mentions guns, you're thinking about, back when you were 14, 15, 7, 10, whatever age you learned, your daddy teaching you how to shoot, spending afternoons out shooting at beer cans, that sort of stuff. Maybe, having to shoot down an animal that was, trying to kill your dog or something like that, right? Wild boar, stuff like that. It's a completely different perspective and image that comes to mind. And that's why there's such a disconnect between both sides on this. And that's why I advocate, instead of, advocating for ban all guns or everybody has access to everything, let's talk about getting firearms out of the hands of people that shouldn't have access to them in the first place. I think that's where we can find common ground. Argus, I agree there is a disconnect, and that disconnect is often very toxic, sadly. Yes, I agree with you. I think both sides aren't willing to communicate with each other. They just get into the my way or the highway, and this is the way it's got to be or else, and nothing ends up getting done. And that's the reason we're still here with so many school shootings and so many mass violence shootings that on my last stream's intro trailer, I literally ran out of space to put all of them. Left Speaks, I was interested in setting up a debate panel. Argos, thank you for this
for silence
the follow.
is over.
Greatly appreciated. waiting for the sound to go away. Smite Night, I was interested in setting up a debate panel, kind of hippy dippy style, with a couple conservative streamers and left wing people. Sound like something you'd be interested in? Always. And as with me, it's always going to depend on the time frame, because my time is so limited. So you're going to have to let me know beforehand when you want to set it up. And then second, it's also going to depend on the topic, right? I generally do not go into debate panels, or I don't try to have any kind of conversation on which I'm not informed and on which I've not refreshed my memory as of recently. I'm comfortable talking about guns right now, and I'm comfortable talking about voting rights and HR1 right now. If you want to go back to something 6 episodes ago, if you're willing to forgive my, memory and all that kind of stuff, and not need specific links, et cetera, absolutely, we can have a conversation. But it depends. I'd need to know what it was up front, and then, like I said, what time frames, and make sure those work. But by all means, reach out to me. Argos, I don't see a ban on all guns. That's not realistic. There are good and viable reasons to have a firearm that I covered, yet I think you touched on it correctly. We have individuals that scream bloody murder for the wrong sentiments. Thanks again. And that's why I said I think that there's common ground that can be reached when you exclude the 2 most vocal minorities, the ban all guns crowd and the everybody can have everything crowd, and the answer to gun violence is more guns. When you start taking those people out of the conversation, I think there's a big chunk of people that you can reach a consensus with in the middle. James Redacted, yeah, we just have a knife crime, which is an issue, but at least you can make a sandwich with a knife. Correct. And also, speaking personally, if me and my family went out to a mall or a school or whatever the case was, I would much rather have to deal with one nut job with a knife, even if I was completely unarmed, than I would rather have to deal with one nut job with a firearm, even if I was armed. And that is even more true when my family's with me. That one nut with a knife is a whole lot easier to handle, even if I'm unarmed. Jack Carlos 12, I don't think I've seen you before. Welcome to the stream, man. I appreciate it. When pressed, a lot of gun guys say that they need them as a check on tyranny. There is a real fantasy of using force against the federal government that undergirds much of gun culture. I don't disagree with you. I think you might have just dropped in. I'm unaware off the top of my head of any time that the Second Amendment has basically been used successfully, I would argue. I'm sure there's a couple here and there, but I can think of a lot more cases where it has not been. Whether it was the Whiskey Rebellion back at the, shortly after the founding of this country, even if you want to go to the United States Civil War, if you want to go to the Trail of Tears, if you want to go to all of our interactions with Native American, indigenous peoples to this country,
the time for silence
Black Panthers
is over.
Jack Carlos, thank you for the follow. Greatly appreciate it. Again, I'm just unaware of where it's been successful. Waco, it doesn't matter which example you want to go to. There's just not a whole lot of examples of successful Second Amendment. We're going to overthrow the power of the state when it comes down to it. And the same is true when you look at foreign countries. So, but again, we have a lot of rural country in this area, or in this country, a lot of rural areas in this country. So I still see a need for firearms, and I don't see a need to have a list of every single firearm that everybody owns. I just don't. I think the problems can be addressed without having that. James Redacted, I couldn't agree more. The issue is that poverty in the UK is a big issue, which breeds violence. My area has a child poverty rate of 40%, and it's top 10 most deprived areas in Northern Europe, so it's bad up here. Poverty breeds crime, period. So, yes, I agree with you. At the Left Speaks from Babylon Done Left. State tyranny can be an issue. A recent example of this was the protesters in Portland during the mass BLM protests who were getting taken in vans by federal agents. I agree with you. I haven't seen the Second Amendment successfully used to deter that in the long term. Look at the Black Panthers and how many of their meeting places and stuff still got raided, still resulted in shootouts, all those sorts of things. However, if you are a ban all guns crowd member, one of the quickest ways to get Republicans on board with gun control again is to just start showing up to all these rallies armed. I'm not advocating for it, but when the Black Panthers were armed, Republicans were in favor of gun control. That's why Reagan signed off on it in California. So if you want to get Republicans to start compromising on it, start exercising your Second Amendment right.
The time for silence is over.
Thank you for the follow, Babylon Done Left. I greatly appreciate it. All right, so we're going to take a real quick look at the Georgia voting law. So there's been a lot of pushback against it, okay? So this is going to cover the pushback real quick.
This morning, from the courts to the Capitol, backlash to Georgia's new election law is growing. Now, opponents are setting their sights on Georgia's business community, hoping pressure on their pockets will push them to speak out against the sweeping law, which includes a new ID requirement for mail-in ballots. Republicans say that it will help secure elections, but critics call it blatant voter suppression. Across the internet, hashtags Boycott Delta and Boycott Coca-Cola are picking up steam, taking aim at the two Georgia-based giants. This morning, Coca-Cola's president says he is disappointed the law passed, adding, "Voting in our country is a sacred right and duty, and we recognize we have a responsibility to protect and promote it." A similar sentiment from Delta Airlines, calling voting access a fundamental right for all citizens. But upsetting some activists after parts of the statement appeared to praise the law, arguing it improved considerably during the legislative process.
It's not just a Georgia issue, it's a national issue, and they can't sit on the sidelines.
With Georgia's law already on the books, those opposed to it are calling on companies to support federal voting rights legislation, and also urging them to speak out against other states weighing laws similar to the one in Georgia. Meanwhile, a Georgia state lawmaker is back on the job after being arrested for knocking on the governor's office door as he signed the bill into law. Escorted by her attorney and Martin Luther King III, State Representative Park Cannon returned to the state capitol on Monday. Her lawyer says she will plead not guilty to the charges against her.
Do you believe that she should have been allowed inside the room?
I absolutely believe she should have been allowed inside the room. And many bills in Georgia are signed in public so the citizens and the elected officials can witness it.
Now, guys, interestingly, some people who are against this law are also against the concept of boycotting businesses. Some people, including the Reverend Bernice King, say that that would only hurt middle-class workers here in Georgia and those who are grappling with poverty.
James, I'll jump on that question in a minute. So what exactly is in the Georgia state voting law? Voters now have less time to request absentee ballots. Strict new ID requirements for absentee ballots, which we've gone over previously, why ID requirements can be a problem. It's now illegal for election officials to mail out absentee ballots to all voters. Drop boxes still exist, but barely. Remember that when we're going to come back to it, because Governor Kemp basically says it's not a problem. Mobile voting centers, think an RV where you can vote, as we saw in that video, are essentially now banned. I have no idea why you would want to ban a mobile voting center. If a polling location goes down, if a polling location develops a leak in the roof, it would be mighty useful to be able to drive an RV over there and let the people that are already in line not have to wait in line for another 10, 12, 15 hours. Early voting is expanded in a lot of small counties, but probably not in the more populous ones. Funny, remember that whole thing I was going on about at the beginning of the show about how voting restrictions are usually used to make it easier for my team to vote and harder for your team to vote? I think everybody, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, as far left as you can imagine to as far right as you can imagine, everybody would tend to agree that more Democrats live in cities than they do in the countryside, and more Republicans live in the countryside than they do in cities. So making it easier for those in more rural locations to vote, while at the same time making it harder for people that live in cities to vote, is weighing the scales. It's tipping the balance in your favor. Me personally, I just want to make it easier for everybody to vote. I don't give a shit where you live or how you vote. Offering food or water to voters waiting in line now risk misdemeanor charges. So if you stand in line to vote in Georgia for 8 hours, which has happened recently, I believe it was a 2018 election, if you have to stand in line for 8 hours and don't get to vote till 1 a.m., nobody can give you a drink or give you a hamburger. You can't call your coworker, your mom, your son, your daughter, your friend, and say, hey, I've been sitting in this damn line for 5 hours and I could really use a bottle of water. The only people that can give it to you, if they choose, is the people that run that polling location. That's it. And they're not mandated to. They can choose to, or they can choose not to. So if you're standing out in the Georgia heat for 4 hours, I can't bring you a bottle of water. Hard Wooden Sock, welcome to the show. I think it's the first time I've seen you in here. ID requirements are a problem. 99% of people have the ability to obtain an ID. 99% of statistics are made up on the spot and are complete fabrications. So I'd be interested in your 99%. The problem is, and I think you just jumped into the show, so I'm not going to hold it against you. The problem is that when this is implemented, it is always implemented unevenly. So for instance, in the state of Texas, a student ID and a state employee ID were not acceptable forms of identification. However, a military ID or a concealed carry permit were acceptable forms of identification. Now, I think even you and I would agree that people that have concealed carry weapon permits are going to tend to vote more Republican than your average person. And we know statistically that people with college educations and young people, you know, the people most likely to have a student ID for a university, tend to vote more Democratic. So if I make it slightly easier for my side and slightly harder for your side to vote, I can game the numbers in my favor. And again, this is all to address a problem, voter fraud, that is less likely than getting struck by lightning. If you're sitting next to your classmate Your classmate is more likely to be struck by lightning while they're sitting next to you than they are to cast a fake ballot. So it's all a solution to a problem that nobody on the conservative side has even demonstrated exists. And if you want me to challenge somebody's fundamental right in a democracy, if you want me to address and make it harder for them to exercise that right, you're going to need a lot more than they might get struck by lightning. I'm just telling you right now. So just like the Dems changed laws for mail-in voting in this election, fortifying it, there were compromises reached in multiple states, in multiple state legislatures between both Republicans and Democrats, depending on the state that you were in, because we were in the middle of a global pandemic that all increased mail-in voting. And again, you're saying it like it's a bad thing. Prove there's a problem with it first, because when I look at the history of it, again, voter fraud is at 0.0009%, less than 1/100%. So why wouldn't I want to make it easier for people, American citizens, to vote? And at Mickey from Hardwood and Sock, not trying to play the blame game, just saying that if we are consistent in criticisms, then we should be criticizing both sides when they make changes. That's all. No, I disagree. We should be criticizing both sides if both sides do something shitty. If I have one side that's trying to make it easier for American citizens to vote, I'm in favor of that. I'm in favor of those changes. If I have another side that's trying to make it more difficult for American citizens to vote based on a stance that has no evidence supporting it, then I'm going to oppose them. Not all changes are good. Not all changes are bad. The change isn't the problem. It's what you're changing it to and why you're changing it. So let's jump to Governor Kemp for the first time.
So you've been in the eye of the storm, so to speak, and now first allied, and now you're kind of warring with the former president of the United States. And then you went out and looked at where Georgia was voting now that the pandemic hopefully is in a rearview mirror, and you made some changes, and you signed this into law. And here's some of the changes. Require a photo for an absentee ballot. Limit time to request absentee ballots. Ballot drop boxes locations, you can have one per county unless the county's really big. Replace the Secretary of State as election board chair with an appointee. Allow election boards to replace election officials in underperforming counties. Reduce the runoff election time. And bars outside groups from handing out food or water in line. First off, on that last one, you can get refreshments. You just don't
Thanks
want
for dropping in, James.
Political organizations to hand them out. It's up to the precincts to do it if they want to do it, correct?
Yeah, that's outrageous what people are saying. And the political groups and others, nonprofits, whoever, can still do that, Brian, if they're outside the 150-foot buffer around the polling location or 25 feet from the end of the line. So it's not like you still can't do those things. We're just trying to keep voters from being harassed and electioneered while they're standing in line preparing to vote. We've had laws like that, and most states have around the country for years. But as you know, hypocrisy is running rampant right now. This bill makes it easy to vote and hard to cheat. I heard you mention on the tease earlier that President Biden got 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post, which is incredible because they're absolutely right. What he was saying is not true. And even more hypocrisy was Stacey Abrams celebrating New Jersey expanding to 9 days of early voting when her own state of Georgia has 17, and we just added more opportunities on the weekend. So They're being mistruthful about what the bill does.
Right, but they're out communicating you because you have the facts on your side, it seems, and even the Washington Post picked that out. First off, the accusation from among people, the President of the United States, on the whole water thing as well as other things. Listen.
So you heard him right there. The whole you can't give water thing to people is completely overrated. You absolutely can. We just don't want people trying to influence how you're going to vote when you're standing in line to vote. So let's look at the reality of the scenario. No person shall solicit votes in any manner or by any means or method. Okay, cool. Got no problem with that. Nor shall any person distribute or display campaign material. Cool. Fine with that. Nor shall any person give or offer to give or participate in the giving of money or gifts. Okay, that's reasonable. Including but not limited to food and drink. Within 150 feet of any building which a polling place is established, within any polling place, or within 25 feet of any voter standing in line to vote at any polling place. So how in the hell exactly am I supposed to give my mother, who's been standing in a Georgia voting line, which again, not 3 years ago, took 8 hours in some locations. How the hell am I supposed to give her anything when not any person, no individual, is allowed to bring anybody in that line food or drink? Because I can't be within 25 feet of the end of the line, and I can't be within 150 feet of the building. Now, I've got a pretty decent arm. And I can throw a football further than 7-8 yards. But I don't know if I can throw a, quarter pounder from McDonald's and a Diet Coke and a side, and a small fry 8-9 yards and hit the one individual that I'm trying to actually get their food to. Because again, remind you, this is in Georgia where we specifically know people have had to stand in 7 and 8 hour lines in order to vote. And nobody is allowed to do this. I was fine with the no polling, no electioneering. That's normal. That makes sense. No giving gifts. Okay, hey, I'm fine. No giving cash. Cool. I'm fine with that. You shouldn't be able to stand out the polling location and say $500 if you vote for Trump. $1,000 if you vote for Biden. But for Governor Kemp to go on Fox News and pretend like you can't bring food and drink to individuals in line, that's totally overblown. That's not what's going on, when that's exactly what the fucking law says, is disingenuous at best. Let me catch up on chat. EOIN 027. I have no idea how to say your brother name. I'm just going to call you E. So I hope that's all right. Let me get back to where you first dropped in. Good evening. How's it's going? It's going excellent. An appointee made by who? Mr. Republican. The appointee would be made by the Republican legislature, if I recall correctly. Literally no other major country has photo ID requirements. UK and Ireland doesn't. Why does America need it? This has been a major event to give reason. There's been no major event to give reason for this. If you believe the lies about election fraud in this country, specifically to the 2020 election, there has been a reason. The problem is none of those are based on evidence. There has been, as I've pointed out, no massive multi-statewide conspiracy theory election fraud proof. It just doesn't exist, right? And the people that have tried to prove this or claim this have failed in court across the country, in multiple courts, in front of multiple judges, in front of Democratic appointed judges, in front of Republican appointed judges, in front of judges appointed by President Trump himself, and they failed everywhere. As a matter of fact, one of the leading attorneys on this whole mess, Sidney Powell, has come out basically saying no reasonable person could have taken anything she said seriously. And yes, we'll provide proof of that, but that's exactly what she claimed in her lawsuit defense from Dominion. So if you're still spouting that stuff, Sidney Powell thinks that you're not a reasonable person, and she was the one pushing it. When push comes to shove, that's her defense. You're nuts if you believed her. Hard wooden sock. So here's a question for you. Would you be okay if a state-issued ID is required for voting? No, I would not. Now, if you could prove that voter fraud was some sort of a problem, and you could find a way to ensure that every single American citizen had a no-cost ID federally, you might be able to get me to start talking about it. But the problem is this stuff has been used extensively to keep people from voting. Poll taxes, requiring somebody to pay a fee when they show up at the ballot box to vote, has been used to keep black people and minorities from voting in the South since the Civil War. That's just a fact. And unfortunately, state IDs are not free, and you have to take time out of your schedule to go to a DMV. So no, you can't get me on board right now to address a problem that you can't even demonstrate is a problem. Demonstrate it's a problem first, then we can start talking about finding equitable solutions to it. Chat going back and forth a little bit. Dash Mickey, why should an ID be required for voting? I have my voting card that says I'm registered to vote. Seconded by E. Yes, I agree. At Dash Mickey from Hard Wooden Sock, we have a state constitution that has to be followed in order for any laws to be changed. Here in PA, in reference to voting laws, it can be passed through the PA House and Senate, and then it goes for referendum, so us voters decide if it's a good idea or a good change. They didn't have this process. We were also in the middle of a global pandemic, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was okay with what happened. So I'm assuming you're not a member of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. I'm also going to make the assumption that you're not an attorney and you're not a judge, and neither the hell am I. So I'm going to defer to their expertise that this was legal. If you have a bone to pick with them in the state of Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, by all means, feel free to go get your law degree, to go pass the Pennsylvania State Bar, and to sue in court and prove your case. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be an attorney or a Supreme Court justice on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And I don't think you should either. From E, I find it ridiculous that people have to wait hours to vote in America. We just nip into the polling station in and out in minutes. 2, if there's a big crowd. Owen. You pronounce your name Owen. Awesome. Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. Owen, welcome to the show. Owen, in a lot of places in America, you can zip in and out of your polling locations and it's not a problem. Not remotely. And Republicans are damn fine with making sure it stays that way if where you live happens to vote majority Republican. Happens not to be down in the inner city. Okay? Those long voter lines, They tend to happen in majority Democratic areas when Republicans control the state. Scrolling down to catch up on chat. Dr. Money, welcome to the show. What's the polling card? They're talking about voter registration. It looks like chat's going at it, so I'm not going to jump in the middle of any of that. I'm down at the bottom. Okay, well, it might be a good reason from Hardwood and Sock. Okay, so while it might be a good reason we have a constitution for a reason, just because the global pandemic doesn't make it okay, in my eyes, to go around the Constitution. Take it up with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Oh, wait, y'all already did? And they disagreed, including the guy that was appointed by Republicans, member of the Federalist Society. And I want to point out here that your position is not that there was voter fraud. Your position is, from what you've said thus far, they made it easier for people to vote and my team lost, so that's bullshit, and I want to make it harder for people to vote again. And this is where you lose me entirely. You're not pointing to cases of actual fraud. You're saying it was too easy for American citizens in Pennsylvania to vote. Therefore, we need to make it more difficult again because my team lost. And you fundamentally lose me at that point. I'm in favor of making it easier for American citizens to vote. Period. Full stop. It's the foundation of democracy. It's the foundation of any democracy. And the fact that you want to change it back to making it harder because your team lost, you need to look in the mirror about that and ask yourself whether you support democracy or not. Whether you're willing to back Republicans because they're your team, even if that goes against the basic foundation of democracy. Because that's what you're doing right now. You're not saying you wanted to stop it because they changed it and there was increased fraud. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court didn't actually rule on the merits of the case. It was dismissed for procedural reasons. If they had ruled on the merits of the case, I 100% would have agreed with you. I'm straw manning you. Come on, man. That is not my argument at all. It would seem to be you're not saying to restrict voting rights and voting access again because of election fraud. Correct me where I'm wrong. And as always, Hardwood and Sock, I think you're new here. Again, welcome to the show. Either anybody from any background is more than welcome to call in at the number down there. I never managed to point directly at it because I get it backwards. Yeah, right there. Okay. Anybody's always welcome to call in. You're always welcome to submit sources up front. As long as you're civil, I'll be civil. We're fine. Okay. If you don't want to call in, there's no pressure. But I do think at a fundamental level, this is what we're talking about. If you're going to agree with me that American citizens should have ease of access to voting and that there's no support for this massive multi-statewide election fraud conspiracy theory bullshit that Trump was presenting, then we don't have much of a disagreement. And if you want to argue the merits or disadvantages to an individual case, then you need to take it up with the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, because that's who ruled on it. And again, I'm willing to bet you're not a juror or a lawyer, and I sure as hell am not. That's just the facts of the matter. I do also know that Republicans and Democrats agreed on those changes. Oh, he might be calling in, guys. We've got somebody screening. I love this auto detector. Card Winsong, Pennsylvania state election. Hold on just a minute, caller. We'll get you in. Welcome. You're live on the air. Can you hear me?
Yeah, how you doing, man? It's hardwood and sock. You know, that auto.
Oh, dude, I figured it was. It just always cracks me up.
Yeah, it was a little wrong there in that case. Am I coming through all right?
Yeah, you're coming through fine. You might want to mute the stream in the background if you haven't already. Just listen to the phone. It makes it easier for you.
Yeah, I got you, bub.
But I appreciate you calling in, man. What you got to say?
So I feel like you're misrepresenting my argument in a really big way. So I'm not for making things harder for Americans. I'm for more making sure that even if that is a what was it? What did you say? A 0.9% fraud or whatever? I just want to make sure that
Hold on. 0.0009% chance of election fraud.
I was in the middle of typing, so I didn't hear that.
No, you're fine.
But in regards to Pennsylvania, like the Georgia thing, I think that there are some good things actually that they're doing. But for instance, the misdemeanor water bottle thing is just a horrible idea.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
That makes no sense to me. Like, I completely understand that point. Like, that's stupid. But because obviously, mainly in cities and stuff, there is a longer voting line, whatever. But
correct.
In regards to what happened here in Pennsylvania, what happened last, 2019? I believe that the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, the Pennsylvania Congress passed a no excuses mail-in voting, right?
Correct. That's my understanding as well.
But it never actually went through the full process that's laid out in our Constitution, you know? And I'm not saying that it would have changed the election. Like that's not what I'm going for here, you know? But I think that we have, you know, a Constitution that we have to follow, right? And when it's not followed, it's reasonable for people that voted for the losing side to point this out and be like, this is fraud and this is messed up and whatever, right?
Okay, so I'm going to pause you for just a second. You're using the word fraud. Can you understand how, to me, that implies that you're like saying, hey, there was fraudulent ballots in this election?
Like, I see how you're trying to put that opinion on me, but I don't.
I'm not trying to put the opinion on you.
I think there were some because.
I'm asking you if you can understand why, from my point of view, it comes across that way.
Yeah, I can understand that. But
okay.
That's why I called in. So, because typing over chat, it would take forever to get that point across.
Exactly. And that's why I've got a toll-free line for anybody who disagrees with me or agrees with me, and conservative callers get priority, brother. I'm not trying to misrepresent anybody here. But when you're talking about, I mean, there were Republicans in the state legislature in Pennsylvania, correct?
Yeah, it was actually the Republicans that passed Prop 217 in 2019.
Okay, so Republicans passed the bill that expanded mail-in voting to everybody.
Correct.
Okay, and were you out protesting and going against this at the time when it passed?
No, because I honestly didn't even know anything about it.
Okay.
You know, like it wasn't on the news here. There was nothing.
Okay, so from my point of view, from the outside, I'm just asking you if you can see my point of view on this, right? Nobody started screaming about this bill that Republicans passed until Republicans lost. And now y'all are calling it fraud. Do you see how that looks ridiculous from the outside?
Of course. And like, I'm not calling it fraud. You know, I think that it is, they passed a bill that didn't go through the proper channels to get fully approved, but they implemented it anyway. Because it was actually due to be on referendum. It was supposed to be on referendum in 2020, but it wasn't. They had already enacted the changes.
And do you think some exception should have been made for that? Because, you know, we were in the middle of a global pandemic and everybody was scrambling to try and make sure we had a, you know, free, fair, and safe election without, you know, causing tens and hundreds of thousands of deaths from spreading the coronavirus?
Of course. And I understand that point of view as well. But then you have, for instance, Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci come out and say that voting is perfectly safe if social distancing was met, if social distancing measures were met. But I mean, that's neither here nor there, but it doesn't matter because we have a constitution for a reason. And to circumvent the constitution just because of a global pandemic, I don't see how that is acceptable.
I don't see how the Constitution, and again, we're talking about the Pennsylvania state constitution. I just want to clarify for anybody jumping in the stream here. I don't see how that it was, you know, circumvented. I mean, that like implies some sort of nefarious intent to get around the rules to. And I just want to remind everybody that, again, by your point of view, you know, that the Republican state legislature is who passed this in 2019, right? These were your side's representatives that passed this. And your side didn't complain at the time. Correct. They only started complaining once they lost. And I appreciate you no longer throwing the word fraud in there. I think you and I both agree that this is not fraud, right? I don't see it being circumvention either. I don't see any nefarious intent to get around rules here. I see a bunch of people trying to do the best they can in the middle of a pandemic to keep people from infecting each other.
Okay, maybe I'm using the wrong word of circumvention, but because I don't think that it was intentional to, like, I don't think there was any ill will behind changing the law, if that makes sense. Being fraudulent happened because the law changed. I think that, like, I value the Constitution, obviously, greatly. I guess I'm sort of a constitutionalist. But so when our Constitution isn't being followed, you know, I feel some sort of way, if that makes sense.
No, I can understand that.
I think that the changes that happened to our election should have been more well communicated to the people of Pennsylvania, because, like, that didn't happen here.
Would it be fair to say that from your point of view, because I'm assuming you live in Pennsylvania?
Correct.
Okay. So I don't, obviously. I mean, full disclosure here, right? But would it be fair from your point of view to say that the changes were communicated equally to both sides? Like there wasn't like Republicans just trying to, you know, tell Republicans and hide it from Democrats and vice versa?
No, I think it was just like no one gave us the information at all. Both sides.
Okay. So it was communicated equally, though, would be my point, right? Both sides either did or didn't know.
Equally poorly.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue whether it was poor or in favor. It was just equal. So again, that's, you know, neither side was trying to game it. I don't know. I mean, from where I'm sitting, okay, even if I agreed with your position, okay, that this bothered me, right? I could see that people were trying to do the best they could during a pandemic, that there was nothing nefarious, that it was passed by my conservative, Republican Party, if I was on your side, that there was no fraud involved and that you didn't see any increase in fraud, which I think I heard you allude to, right, as a result of this change. If I wanted to reverse that change, I don't know why I would want to reverse that change. I might want the referendum on it still to confirm it, but I don't see why I would want to revert that unless I just wanted less people voting.
Of course. And like that's what I mean. I'm not trying to reverse the change. I want it to go to referendum in 2022. And if the voters in Pennsylvania like shut it down, well, then obviously it goes back to the way it was. Now, personally, I don't know how I feel about it. I want to do more research about it, but my whole issue with it was that the referendum was skipped, if that makes sense.
No, that does, but none of that's fraud. None of that's ill intent, right? And in terms of,
correct,
if you and I agree at a fundamental level that, Americans in democracy should be able to vote, like that's a fundamental right in any democracy, right? Then I don't see why you would be opposed to this when you've already said that you didn't see any increased fraud from it either.
Correct. Yeah. But I don't know how I'm going to vote in 2022. I would probably actually vote for the mail-in voting expansion.
Well, I would appreciate that because, like I said, I want to make it easier for everybody to vote as long as they're, legal citizens and, et cetera. And you're seeing the same thing I have by your own admission that there was no increase in fraud, right? You might have had one here, one there, just like we always do, but there's nothing that's like massively historically upsetting.
No, and of course the ones that get televised are the Republicans that do it because the Republicans do it too.
Yeah, I mean both sides do it.
Here and act like, I'm not going to sit here and act like the Republicans are holy,
But when both sides do it, it's such a small degree and so historically ineffective that it's pointless. Like I said, if you and I are sitting, let's say we're next door neighbors, right? You and I are next door neighbors, right? And we're both going to cast our votes by mail, right? It is more likely that you're going to get struck by lightning than it is that you're going to cast a fake ballot. And the same is true for me. So why the hell would I want to make it more difficult for Americans to vote based off of that? Right? I'm not running around saying, hey, we need to erect lightning rods everywhere so that way we can protect voters on the way to the polls. And this is why I said, to me, this is a bunch of solutions in search of a problem. Like nobody has shown that the problem actually exists.
Of course. No, like I'm actually in agreement with you there.
Okay.
But, I agree that in this election, I'm not one of those sorry, I don't know if there's cursing allowed on your stream.
Nah, dude, you can say whatever the fuck you want.
I'm not one of those. All right. I'm not one of those like fucking crazy conspiracy theorists,
Thank you.
Which now they're coming out that they're like, oh, it's a fake, like, oh, there was never actually any fraud.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like
we didn't mean all that crazy stuff we said.
Yeah. Like I'm not subscribed to any of that. You know what I mean? But now, like I also disagree with you in regards to ID. I know that there's a difference between voter ID and just using a state issued ID.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, and I agree with you. Like with state IDs should be free.
Let me pause you for just a second. Scrublord 1963. Why do you have the Constitution as a backdrop? Dems use it for toilet paper. Republicans aren't much better. I signed up to protect and defend this Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I don't use it for toilet paper. If you need to speak for yourself, but don't project your views onto anybody else. At least come in and, have a conversation and learn to talk back and forth civilly, and then we can have some kind of conversation. But if you're just coming in to be a meme lord, edgelord, and have nothing productive or substantive to contribute, then there's no point in you being here, brother. This isn't like a meme chat. I'm not going to, jump up and down or dance or anything like that. So you're in the wrong location. We're having a serious conversation right now. You're welcome to jump in if you want to. Sorry for the interruption there.
No, you're good, man. I hate people that can't have civil conversations, because that's what I'm all about.
Exactly.
And I feel like both sides are equally terrible at it.
Well, you can't learn or educate if you can't have a civil conversation, right? I'm sure there's some things I could learn from you, and there's some things you could learn from me, right? But if we're just going to scream at each other and try to, meme each other we're not accomplishing anything. Nobody gets any better. If we want to make this country better again, we want to make America great again, like so many conservatives say they want to do, we need to learn how to have civil conversations with each other again.
Of course, I completely agree with you, which is why I called in.
Well, I appreciate you calling in, but I was sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your point. You were going ahead and saying you disagreed with my take on state voter IDs and voter IDs in general?
Correct. So, I understand that there's a difference between voter ID and just a state-issued ID.
Mm-hmm.
Like a voter ID has to go through different channels, I believe, correct?
It depends. Basically, the short version is anytime somebody's talking about voter ID, they're saying that they're going to make it okay for certain forms of ID to be acceptable at the polls and other forms to not be acceptable. So like in Texas, when they passed this, they said you got to have ID to vote, period, full stop, right? They may have had you can sign an affidavit and have 3 witnesses type exception, but basically the rule was you had to have some form of ID to vote and be acceptable. Now the problem with that is what forms of ID are we going to allow, right? So in Texas, if you had a military ID, you were good. If you had a concealed carry weapons permit, you were good. Those were acceptable, even if you didn't have a driver's license or state ID. Okay. However, if you had a student ID, right, that was unacceptable. And if you had a state employee ID, like you worked for the state of Texas, that was unacceptable. Well, call me crazy, but concealed carry weapon permits folks, the people that are likely to have that form of ID, just happen also to be more likely to vote Republican. Whereas we know that young people, college students, right, and college educated, again, the people that would have student IDs, right, are more likely to vote Democrat. So when you're getting rid of when one picture form of ID is okay and the other form is not, and they just happen to always align with party lines, this is a problem. And this is not the first time we've dealt with this historically. North Carolina did this shit too. They went and figured out who was voting and how after all of a sudden they passed some laws that said, basically increased minority turnout in North Carolina. And then they went and requested data by race, to figure out who used what IDs, right? And if it just happened to be an ID that black people used more, then all of a sudden that form of ID you couldn't use anymore.
Is over.
Thank you, Play 90 Scott. I appreciate the follow. Like I said, it's not a huge problem. I could understand the concept, right? I'm worried about people showing up and pretending to be Bob Smith and voting for, more Democrats or voting for more Republicans. The problem is every time it's implemented, every single time they implement this shit, they use it to restrict people who are going to vote against them. Every time.
Okay. So I guess we might actually agree somewhat here. Obviously I agree with, those specific forms of ID aren't, I would say that none of them are good enough.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that except maybe the Texas state, the state workers ID.
Yeah, the state employee ID.
If you work for the state. I could see that as being acceptable, but I don't see a student ID being acceptable or a concealed carry being acceptable, or I guess a military ID I would accept as well.
See, honestly, I would be fine with pretty much any of them. I mean, they're all verified by a third-party institution. They got your photo on them, all that kind of stuff. But all of it boils back down to, right, you're asking me to implement something that makes it harder for Americans to vote based off something that is less likely than them being struck by lightning, right? You haven't proven that there's a problem yet, right? It's like if I said, hey, I want to build a dome around the country because, aliens are coming in and voting, from outer space, right? I can point to all the ways we could build this dome that would stop the problem, but I haven't shown that it's really a problem yet. And until you can point out where it's actually a problem, you're going to be you're asking me to make it harder for somebody to exercise a fundamental right in any democracy. And we can't even show that we need to. That's where the stop That's where you lose me, like right off the start, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in general, the government tends to make a bunch of laws and legislations that they don't really need to, right?
I don't know that I agree with that, but I mean, you can get me on board with like there's some laws that have unintended consequences or that have been on the books too long or all that kind of stuff, right? But you're not going to get me on board with, hey, we're just going to make extra regulations for no reasons. And I mean, hell, if you're the small government conservative, you should be with me on this, right? There's no problem here that we can find. Why the hell would we want to make it more restricted by the government?
Because I think that it would eliminate any of the issues that did arise after the 2020 election.
You haven't shown that there are any issues, though.
No. I know that there were no major issues in this last election.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is it would prevent any of this conspiracy stuff from bubbling up.
Would it?
Well, in my opinion, it would, because if federally, like every state had, you had to use a state issued ID, right? Just across the board, you had to have a state issued ID.
Okay.
Which I think they should be free. I agree with you there. Then if your side loses and everyone had to use a state issued ID, well, you can't come up with some conspiracy that there was fraud. You know what I mean?
Do you think
so
they
then
can't?
You won't have this huge.
I mean, brother, they were just
find a way.
Yeah, I mean, look at the shit.
They'll find a way.
Yeah, look at the shit in Georgia, right? You had the, Dominion, or they were switching votes between Trump and Biden, right? And then Dominion was dumping a whole bunch of extra votes into the system somehow. And then you did, 2 computer count audits and 1 hand count audit, none of which found extra ballots than there were voters, right? And none of which showed it going from sliding from one person to the next. But people still fucking believe it anyway, right? I guess, again, man, until we can show that it's a real problem, right? I'm not going to infringe on other American citizens' rights, fundamental basic right to vote, just to make somebody that's crazy feel more comfortable. I mean, are you a second A guy? Are you like a gun owner?
Oh yeah, I'm a big 2A guy.
Okay, so there's a lot of people that don't know jack shit about guns on my side, right? Should I make it a whole lot more difficult for you to own any firearm whatsoever just because it would make them feel better?
See, I'm actually in agreement with universal background checks.
No, I'm saying we're going to just take it away because it makes them feel better.
Well, no, that's just dumb. I'm not talking about taking away people's rights, In
a lot of cases you are. I mean, when it was implemented in Georgia, they purged 53,000 people off the ballots when they enacted one of their voter match registration rules when the governor of Georgia was the Secretary of State. 53,000 names just poof like that off the voter rolls, and 70% of them just happened to be black.
Of course. And that is something I completely don't subscribe to.
And this is what I'm saying on its face. And I know you wouldn't, right? Most reasonable Americans wouldn't. And again, I assume you jumped in the middle of the episode, but I said at the beginning, I used to be conservative. Most conservatives and I agree. And I find that most, anecdotally, conservatives I talk to agree with, hey, we want to be fair to everybody, as fair as we can, and we want to follow some common sense rules, right? I'm fine with that. But every time this shit gets implemented by Republican legislatures, they don't do it. There's no reason why, if I purge 50,000 names, 70% of them should just happen to be black. I mean, come on, really?
Well, I don't agree to that at all,
Exactly, but they're using you to get this shit in place.
Of course. And so I guess the question I'm going to throw at you is if, it was, strictly just state issued ID, right? driver's license or just state issued, personal identification card, right? And that was required to vote. Isn't that similar to universal background checks?
Yes and no, because I can prove that we have a unique problem in this country as compared to the rest of the world with firearms violence. Whereas you can't prove that we have an election fraud issue. Right? I'm not talking about how people feel about guns, right? These people aren't imagining that we have tons of mass shootings and that we have higher suicide rates compared to other countries and we have higher gun violence compared to other countries. And again, I'm assuming you jumped in at the point where you realize that I'm pretty pro-gun because I'm in favor of universal background checks and a little bit further restrictions than that, right? But that's the difference. I can point to real harm this is doing and compare it to other countries and say, okay, yeah, we seem to have a problem here that we should address, right? And I'm fine with compromising with you on that. But you're not pointing to that we have a real problem with election fraud. You're just wanting me to make people feel better when you and I have both admitted that they're, conspiracy theory nuts. I'm not going to cater to them. I can't. If I start catering to people based off stuff that's not based in reality, what's next? I start, looking for the Jewish space lasers that the, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman, thinks exist. Am I supposed to pass laws against that too? Yeah, she's absolutely nuts.
She's whack too. Like I don't subscribe to her either.
I know. And you're not the Republican I have a problem with, man. The one that I have a problem with is the fact that only 5% of the Republicans in Congress voted to remove her from her committee. 94.5% voted to leave her on her committee. They were okay with Jewish space laser girl representing the Republican Party on the department or on the education committee. I'm not okay with compromising with fantasies, man.
See, I have mixed feelings about this though. Because while yes, she's crazy, she was elected into office in her district. Yeah. Right. Representing her district. So if we vote to kick her out of committees, committees, I guess I'm kind of okay with, but if we vote to remove her from the House, right, then all those people's voices aren't being heard.
So you send you send her ass back and you say, sorry guys, try again. She's not based in reality.
Yeah, but that's not acceptable.
It is. It's already, it's in there. Congress doesn't have to seat her ass.
But she still has to represent those people.
She doesn't have to.
She was voted in to represent that district.
She was voted in to represent that district, and that Congress can say, I'm sorry, you're too fucking batshit crazy, and send them back and say, Georgia, try again.
Yeah, I don't know. I just don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I don't agree with her at all. You know what I mean?
No, I get it.
I just feel like she was voted in by her representatives, by her constituents. And, as crazy as it might be, like we have to, not necessarily listen to her, but she has a right to be present at the House. If that makes sense.
I can understand where you're coming from. I just fundamentally disagree. But then we're back to kind of the root of our disagreement, right? She's advocating for shit that's based in fantasy, and I can't compromise with that. I'm not going to make, compromises to make the Jewish space laser conspiracy theorist feel better. Just like I'm not willing to make compromises and ask other American tax-paying citizens to make it more difficult for them to vote because conspiracy theorists think that there's all this election fraud going on. Until either one of them can point to a real, demonstrable, evidence-based problem, right? I'm not going to inflict other American citizens with issues or with difficulties to try and remedy a made-up problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think we're just going to, agree to disagree, at the end of the day on this one. I agree that the stipulations that a bunch of these states have are disproportionately hurting certain communities.
Okay.
Where it shouldn't be like that. Whereas I would be on board if it was, hey, you need a state-issued ID. That's it. That's the only acceptable ID. And then I would get on board with it.
Don't we already do that with voter registration, though?
What's that?
I said, don't you basically already do that when you register to vote?
I don't know how most states work, but yeah, here in Pennsylvania, you register to vote when you get your ID.
Yeah. And that's basically one of the provisions of HR1 is, right, automatic voter registration in a lot of these different scenarios, right? Expanded mail-in voting, no excuse mail-in voting. And you've already admitted that you don't have a problem with, mail-in voting on its face. You just had a complaint about the process, but you could understand that it wasn't nefarious and wasn't fraud, right? So if we did this nationwide, I don't see why this is an issue, right? You've already conceded that there wasn't, neither you nor me is, buying this big conspiracy that there were all these fake ballots mailed in and all that kind of shit, right? Campaign finance reform, knowing where all the money that's coming into all these, not-for-profits that are running all these attack ads before the elections. I imagine you and I would find common ground there as well. I don't think we actually agree to disagree on all that much. I think we agree on a lot of the individual policy procedures that we're putting into place. I think where we fundamentally are disagreeing is you and I both admit that this election fraud bit is a fantasy, that there's no evidence to back this up. But you're saying I should implement voter ID laws to help make the people that think that the fantasy is reality feel better, and I'm saying I shouldn't. Do you think that's a fair summation?
Yeah, well, yeah, pretty much, because, it happened in 2016, it happened in 2020 as well. Both sides are kind of guilty of pointing out these conspiracies that, both elections were stolen, essentially, which neither of them were.
Oh, I don't see either side. No, there's a big difference between ballots versus somebody saying there was propaganda and money influence. Those are two huge different things to me, right? If we're talking about propaganda, that's one thing. If we're talking about actually fraudulently filling out ballots and submitting them into the system to be counted, those are two entirely different things.
Oh, no, of course. But I'm talking to, there were certain people on the Democratic side that were saying that the Russians stole the election.
Yeah, but we're talking.
The Russians came in and stole the election.
Yeah, but when they're saying that, they're saying the Russians, ran advertising, essentially, that was targeted at, fake information. That's not the same thing as, hey, I filled out a bunch of fake ballots and dumped them in a box, right? We're talking about two totally different things here.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. I'm going to give you the last bit, and then I've got to wrap up the show, but I appreciate you calling in.
Yeah, man, no problem.
Any final words?
No, thanks for having me, man. Good conversation. We obviously agree on a lot, but disagree on one thing.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. Thank you for calling in, man. You're more than welcome to call back anytime. I greatly appreciate it. Have a good one.
Yes, sir. Take it easy.
Looks like Scrub Lord's been active in the chat, and we're going to have to wrap this down because I'm already 38 minutes into overtime. Thank you so much for the call. I greatly appreciate it. For anybody that didn't catch the beginning of it, that is Hard Wooden Sock who called in. You're more than welcome to call back anytime, my man. A very civil conversation and greatly appreciate it. I'm just going to pick out a few things from Scrub Lord here really quick. Dems always pull the race card. It's the only card in their deck. It's all lies. It's not. Go back and rewatch the stream from the beginning. It's also not the only card in the deck. But as I pointed out, when 53,000 names are scrubbed from Georgia's voter rolls after they pass a law for exact matching, and 70% of those names just happen to be black, it's not my fault that reality is showing that you passed a law that has a racial bias.
The time for
Thank you for the follow, Hard Wooden Sock. I greatly appreciate it. Every state needs to follow Georgia's lead. You need to prove, again, if you want to get me on board with you, you're going to have to prove that there's an actual election fraud problem here that I need to address. I don't deal in fantasies. I don't. I follow evidence, I follow reason, I follow logic. And if you can't prove evidentially that there's a problem here, you're never going to get my support. Okay. Something about Nixon. I have no idea what Scrub Lord's going on about here. Something about Mazo. I don't even know who Mazo is. Maybe he meant Mao. Why don't we balance the budget? That's hilarious. The government isn't your family budget. Okay? It makes sense when interest rates are low to invest in the American people, the American infrastructure, and the health of the American people during a global pandemic. And I think that's probably going to wrap it up for us today. I appreciate everybody that tuned in, everybody that commented, everybody that liked, followed, subscribed. This will be your last chance to get the alert to play if you want to play that and you want to like, follow, and all that fun stuff, depending on which service you're following me at. If you want to see the bit on guns from last week, go to the YouTube channel or go to the website, www.theleftspeaks.com. All of my work is up there. You are more than welcome to comment, like, subscribe on anything that's old. I will address it if I can. As for this show, we got sidetracked a little bit into guns from last week, but that's always going to happen. And I will post all the links that I used for source material into the YouTube comments and into the YouTube description so you can track that all down. Probably happen tomorrow. Again, thank you for everybody that tuned in. Thank you especially for calling in. And that's going to wrap it up for us today. See you next Sunday, 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And we're going to run the intro as the outro. Thanks again, everybody. The time for silence is over. There was once an unprecedented time in American history when common citizens of their day began to define the rights of man and documented how those rights were being violated by their current government. They wrote to each other. They debated with each other. Ultimately, it was these common citizens who recorded these rights for all eternity, and furthermore created a new and free nation founded on these rights with liberty and justice for all of its citizens. Times have changed, but these rights remain.
I don't take responsibility.
That all citizens have the right to life. That all citizens have the right to pursue happiness. That all citizens are created equal. That all citizens have the right to a public trial. That all citizens have the right to peacefully assemble. That all citizens have the right to petition their government. What happens when you try to exercise these rights today? Is this government honoring your rights? Or are they violating them? Is this the government that those citizens aspired to? There is a solution.
I don't take responsibility. I don't take responsibility. I don't take responsibility.
Join me every Sunday afternoon for a new show where common citizens, you and I together, discuss with each other issues of today, where we demand proof and evidence is required,
where we seek the truth and will not be silent. Join me this coming Sunday afternoon and take part in America's oldest and most honored tradition.